Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. In 1630, and over the next 10 years, about 20,000 Puritans emigrated from England to Massachusetts and the neighboring colonies during what came to be known as the Puritan migration to New England. One such migrating Puritan was English minister Roger Williams, who founded the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Let's travel back with Eric Yanis of the Other States of America podcast to learn more about this remarkable time in North American history.
Over the winter of 1636, native messengers traveled to and from Salem to communicate with those who were still willing to follow Roger Williams, known to all students of history famously as the founder of Rhode Island, who now planned in coordination with the natives to make a colony of his own, which would be a refuge to anyone searching for freedom of conscience and willing to live peaceably. His wife and children remained in Salem, including their newborn daughter named Freeborn. A lot of symbolism there. And as much anxiety as Williams must have felt over the winter, there was also a lot of opportunity, a lot to look forward to at this point. He had wandered the wilderness and now was organizing his fold and would be leading his own exodus. From the point of view of the Wampanoag, which is rarely spoken of, their traditional enemies were the Narragansett, who did not have direct access with the Plymouth settlers or the Massachusetts settlers. The Massachusetts tribe and the Wampanoag having control of those contact points. To the west, they competed with the Pequot for attention from the Dutch traders. The Narragansett wanted European traders of their own, which sounds strange to modern ears. You think that the natives should be weary of Europeans. But remember, we're talking 1636. The English are few in number, and they provide useful trade goods you can't otherwise get. And if they really like you, they'll sell you guns, and they're an additional ally to be used against your traditional enemies. Now, Osamequin of the Wampanoag, he decided to settle Roger Williams down in what is now Rumford, Rhode Island, which would be at the edge of the Wampanoag territories, but firmly within their boundaries and bordering the Narragansett. This way, that often volatile no man's land between nations would be filled by a third party who could serve as arbitrator or just a block between them and a trading partner for both. Because although the Wampanoag were quite strong at this point through their allegiance with the Plymouth colony, they never had the numbers, again, that the Narragansett had. Because of earlier plagues that swept through New England, greatly reduced the number of Wampanoag, and not so much the Narragansett. Osamequin knew it would be better to try to pacify them, and perhaps start to strengthen those links between neighbors. Members of his Salem fold start to trickle in slowly to this new settlement. Small as it was, the Plymouth colony eventually took notice, and based on the land that they had purchased from Osamequin, they believed that Roger Williams' new settlement actually fell within their own colony. And at first, they didn't really care too much about that. They were fairly welcoming, if not just benign, towards Roger Williams. But the Massachusetts colony, far greater in number, far more powerful, pressured the Plymouth colony to send Roger Williams basically an eviction notice. Governor Winslow told Williams specifically that they were loath to displease the Bay. But the governor said that if they would only remove to the other side of Narragansett Bay, they would be happy neighbors. Osamequin consented to this idea, and Roger Williams went to the Narragansett on the western edge of the bay, whom he had some familiarity with and traded with when he lived in the Plymouth colony. And from the sachems Canonicus and Mayatonome, he purchased the land that would become Providence, and probably more familiar to you as Providence Plantations. Now this location, not that far from the original, served the same purpose, except being in Wampanoag territory, it was now in Narragansett territory. But he would still serve as the go-between and peacekeeper of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. Also, yearly he would provide tribute to the Narragansett, in acknowledgement that his land purchase also came with the establishment of a relationship between the two entities, which you will find to be the native view. You don't just buy land outright from a native nation. If you acquire the land from a native nation, you are also beginning the process of binding two groups of people to one another. And specifically, these tributes would go to Canonicus, who Rogers came to see as kind of like a father figure. And like with Osamequin, he never forgot the generosity that these two native sachems provided him. And in his own words, provided him when the hearts of my countrymen and friends failed me. He goes on to say quite clearly that Providence was a settlement not founded on conquering, not founded on an English charter, not bought and paid for, but a settlement founded on love. And that's the term he uses. Which brings us to an interesting point, and one you just don't expect to see in an English colony, that Providence had the full approval of two separate native nations, whom you can argue quite convincingly decided exactly where to put Roger Williams. If this was a game of chess, he was their pawn. At the end of the day, it was the natives who said, Providence will be right here. On the flip side of things, in terms of the position of Providence within this English empire, Providence had no permission, grant, charter, anything from any English authority in 1636. Which brings us back to where John Wheelwright created the Exeter Compact, what is described as semi-independent republic in the middle of New Hampshire, which was at the time without government. Which brings us back to the topic and the strange habit that English people had at the time. In lieu of having any established government, they feel they have the right to make one for themselves. This act of self-determination appears self-evident to us today, but it seems to be quite unique in the Western world among the English. The French, they aren't doing this. The Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they're not doing this. But we'll see time and time again, when the English have the opportunity to form their own compact, combination, to write up a constitution, they do it. And obviously, this flows right into mainstream American history. And because it's present at such an early date, I can only conclude the attitude that you have the right to form your own government comes from merry old England. Roger Williams and his crew were actually not the first Englishmen to settle the area of Providence. Reverend Blackstone, he became a bit of a hermit, and he resided in a secluded area that is now Boston. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony sent over their first boatload of colonists, he welcomed them, but soon found himself crowded out once again, and he retreated to Narragansett country. And now his seclusion would be broken by Roger Williams, who will be the spearhead for dissidents turning away from Massachusetts and heading south. One of the first things that Williams does is he creates a compact, and not one that he plans on enforcing right away or is even done working on. He sends a draft of it to Governor Winthrop of Massachusetts for advice. This might sound weird, but if you remember, it might have been Governor Winthrop who warned Roger Williams that they were planning on putting him on a boat and sending him back to England. The truth of the matter is, Governor Winthrop had a lot of money invested in Williams and his various trading operations with the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, and they'll continue to have a long correspondence after this point. Winthrop on the surface appears to be everything Roger Williams is against, but when money is involved and safety, you make strange bedfellows. So without any finalized compact, Williams allowed the first iteration of Providence to be run by a simple majority. The men who headed the various families would be able to simply raise their hand and vote on an issue, and whatever the majority wants, the majority gets. And indeed, like many early colonies, Roger Williams devised Providence as being more of a corporate organization than a municipality. And all of these heads of families, they owned Providence together as common stock with equal distribution, and that includes the land. Roger Williams divided up all the land equally between families, including for himself. He didn't put himself ahead of the others. This is somewhat similar to the very early settlement of Plymouth, but is quite different than a lot of the Puritan colonies, such as the colony of New Haven. Definite recognition of who was the leader, who would get more, who would get less. Providence didn't have this, and it would be very hard to even know that Roger Williams was the founder, originator, or shepherd of the colony, which would be inundated by a second and third wave of settlers, many coming from Salem. Slowly, all of Roger Williams' followers from back in Massachusetts were found out and exiled if they would not repent. And as they fled into Providence, Roger Williams would sell them the land at cost. And so whatever amount he had to pay the natives for that parcel, he would now expect that from a new settler, and then they would own it outright. It became routine that the heads of the various families would meet every 2 weeks. As the families became more numerous, it became time to create the position of what they called a single town officer, which Roger Williams was elected to. He would be the presiding officer over these town meetings. And what's interesting here is that he did everything in the name of the king, implying that somehow his power as town officer or the legitimacy of Providence was dependent upon the King of England, when in fact the King of England had not authorized such a settlement, probably had never even heard of it. But Roger Williams knew if some official of the king did come by, or he was called back to England to testify as to the validity of his settlement, he could show records that would imply the allegiance that they had toward the king and England in general. So at worst, just a meaningless gesture, but a potentially useful tool later on.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.